There is a version of you that already knows something is wrong. Not wrong with your life, exactly. Wrong with the gap. The gap between how much work you have put in and how little has actually changed. You have done the meditations. You have said the affirmations. You have burned the sage, kept the journal, pulled the cards, sat in the silence. You have consumed more content about healing and consciousness and vibration than most people will encounter in a lifetime. And yet, here you are, still triggered by the same people, still shrinking in the same rooms, still lying awake at 2 a.m. with the same low hum of anxiety that no amount of breath work seems to touch, still wondering, quietly, whether something is fundamentally broken in you that all of this simply cannot fix. I want to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it, because it changed everything for me, and I believe it will change everything for you. The problem is not that you haven't done enough. The problem is that everything you have been told to do was designed to make you feel like you're growing, without asking you to give up the one thing that is actually keeping you stuck. Spiritual growth, as it is sold to most people, is an addition strategy. Add a new practice, add a new ritual, add a new teacher, a new modality, a new framework. Keep layering, keep building, keep accumulating evidence that you are on the path. But Carl Jung, who spent decades studying the human psyche at a depth that most modern self-help will never touch, discovered something that quietly demolishes this entire approach. He found that transformation is not an addition process. It is a subtraction process. Real elevation of consciousness does not happen because you added something. It happens because you finally let something die. He called this process individuation, becoming whole unto yourself. And the path to it was not paved with new practices. It was paved with radical release, the willingness to let the version of yourself you have been protecting, performing, and preserving finally come apart. Now, I know that sounds frightening, because that version of yourself is not some abstract concept. It is your identity. It is the way you show up in rooms, the role you play in your relationships, the story you tell yourself about who you are and why you are that way. And Jung was unflinching about this. You cannot elevate your consciousness while clinging to the patterns that belong to a lower one. Something has to go. 5 something specifically. Today I am going to walk you through the 5 things you must give up to genuinely vibrate higher. Not manage, not modify, not put in a journal and revisit on a Sunday. Give up, let die, grieve. And I am going to be honest with you about why each one is harder than it sounds. Because I have been in this work long enough to know that the version of this conversation that does not tell you the hard part is the version that leaves you exactly where you are. Before we go there, I want to be clear about one thing. This is not a criticism of your journey. The fact that you have been seeking, that you have been trying, that you have been showing up for yourself in the ways you knew how, that is not something to be ashamed of. That is evidence of your desire for something real. But desire alone is not transformation. And the gap between desire and actual change is where these 5 things live. The first thing you must give up is the need to be seen as a good person. I know how that sounds. Stay with me. Jung identified what he called the persona. It is the mask we construct over time, often beginning in childhood, to make ourselves acceptable to the people around us. It is the version of us that is agreeable when we actually feel furious, generous when we actually feel depleted, understanding when we actually feel hurt, available when we actually need to disappear. The persona is a performance, and it is one we have rehearsed so thoroughly that we often cannot tell where the performance ends and we begin. Here is the part that makes this so insidious. Most people who are spiritually oriented, who care about consciousness and healing and vibration, are some of the most committed performers of goodness on the planet. Because the spiritual community, with all its genuine beauty, also carries an unspoken hierarchy. Conscious people are calm. Awake people are kind. High vibe people do not get angry, do not set hard limits, do not say things that make others uncomfortable. And so you have been suppressing a vast range of your actual human experience in the name of appearing evolved. Jung found that this performance operates at one of the lowest frequencies a human being can run. Not because being kind is low frequency, but because performing kindness from a place of fear, the fear of being rejected, being judged, being seen as bad or difficult or not spiritual enough, is rooted in survival consciousness. And you cannot access a higher frequency from survival consciousness, no matter how many candles you light while doing it. The people Jung observed who genuinely elevated their consciousness had one striking thing in common. They had stopped performing goodness and started practicing authenticity, which meant they could be generous and they could say no. They could be compassionate and they could also be fierce. They could love deeply and they could also disappoint people without spiraling. They were not trying to appear good. They were trying to be honest. And that shift from performance to honesty is one of the most radical frequency elevations a human being can make. You will go. Now you have begun to release this need when you can disappoint someone and feel sad about it without feeling ashamed of yourself. When you can be misunderstood and resist the urge to explain yourself into their acceptance. When you can be called selfish by someone who has benefited from your selflessness for years and feel stable in your own knowing anyway. That stability, that unshakable internal ground, is not coldness. It is a very high frequency place to live. The second thing you must give up is the compulsion to save people who have not asked to be saved. This one is going to land differently depending on who you are. If you are someone who has always been the helper in your relationships, the one people call when things fall apart, the one who spots what everyone needs before they even articulate it, the one who cannot watch someone struggle without feeling a physical pull to intervene, then this section is going to feel like I am asking you to cut off a limb. Because the helper identity is not just something you do. For many people, it is the entire architecture of how they understand their own worth. Jung studied what he called the wounded healer archetype extensively, and what he found consistently across thousands of patients and years of clinical observation was that compulsive helping almost never originates from a place of genuine compassion. It originates from unhealed pain. The helper learned, usually very early in life, that their value to the people around them was conditional on their usefulness. Love was not freely given. It was earned through being needed, through being the one who fixed things, smoothed things, absorbed things. And so the psyche built an entire identity around being indispensable, because indispensable people do not get abandoned. Do you see how that works? On the surface, it looks like generosity. It looks like service. It looks like one of the most spiritually admirable ways a person can move through the world. And that is precisely why it is so difficult to examine honestly. Because to look at your helping and ask whose needs it is actually serving requires a level of courage that most people find genuinely confronting. Here is the diagnostic question Jung would want you to sit with. When someone you care about does not take your advice, does not use your help, does not get better in the way you were trying to help them get better, what do you feel? If the honest answer is something close to frustration or abandonment or a quiet sense of personal failure, then your helping has been about you, not in a selfish way, in a wounded way, in the way that humans who were taught that love is conditional will always try to remain useful enough to keep earning it. And that pattern, that constant, anxious monitoring of whether you are needed enough, whether you are doing enough, whether the people in your life are okay enough for you to feel safe, runs at an exhausting, grinding, low frequency, because it is never finished. There is always another person who needs something. There is always another crisis to absorb. There's always one more conversation, one more check-in, one more sacrifice of your own peace in the name of someone else's comfort. And underneath all of it is the unspoken terror. If I stop being useful, who am I? If no one needs me, do I matter? Jung's answer to that question is the hardest and most liberating thing he ever observed. He found that the people who genuinely elevated their consciousness had arrived at a place where their worth was not located in other people's need for them at all. They had developed what he called a relationship with the self, a sense of internal value that did not require external confirmation. They could offer help when it was genuinely asked for and genuinely appropriate, and they could also step back without guilt when it was not. They could watch someone move through their own struggle without needing to interrupt that struggle, because they understood something profound. Sometimes the most loving thing you can offer another person is the space to find their own way through. This is not indifference. Please hear that clearly. Releasing the compulsion to save people is not the same as becoming cold or disconnected or self-absorbed. It is the difference between helping from overflow and helping from depletion. It is the difference between genuine service and ego-driven rescue. When you help from overflow, from a place of genuine abundance and sincere choice, that help carries a completely different frequency than the help you give because you are afraid of what happens to your sense of self if you do not. The practical reality of releasing this is that some of your relationships will change shape, and that'll be painful. There are people in your life who found you specifically because you were someone who would always show up, always absorb, always give more than was given back. And when you stop performing that function, some of them will not know what to do with you. Some will feel abandoned. Some will tell you that you have changed, that you are not as caring as you used to be, that something has been lost, and they will not be entirely wrong. Something will have been lost. The version of you that needed to be needed will have begun to die, and grief is the appropriate response to that, even when the death is a necessary one. What replaces it is something quieter and far more solid. The ability to be genuinely present with people without an agenda for their outcome. The ability to care about someone's well-being without making their well-being your responsible ability to manage. The ability to say, I trust you to handle this, and mean it as an act of love rather than an act of abandonment. That quality of presence, unhurried, unattached to outcome, genuinely offered rather than anxiously performed, is one of the highest frequency ways one human being can show up for another. You will know you are beginning to release this when someone shares a problem, and your first instinct is to listen rather than fix. When you can say that sounds really hard without immediately following it with a solution. When you can let the people you love have their own experiences, including the difficult ones, without making those experiences a referendum on your worth as a person. That is not detachment. That is freedom. And it is available to you on the other side of this particular death. The third thing you must give up is the need for people to understand you. This one operates so quietly that most people do not even recognize it as a pattern. It does not announce itself the way anger does, or grief, or fear. It hides inside conversations that go 30 minutes longer than they needed to. It lives in a text message you rewrote 4 times, trying to find the exact phrasing that would finally make someone get it. It shows up in the exhaustion you feel after explaining yourself again to someone who still walked away with the wrong impression of who you are and why you did what you did. And it whispers every single time that if you could just find the right words, the right angle, the right moment, they would finally understand, and then you would feel okay. Jung identified this as one of the most subtle and most draining patterns he observed in people seeking transformation. The need to be understood is so deeply woven into how most of us were taught to relate to the world that we do not even question it. Of course you want to be understood. Oh, of course it matters that the people in your life see you clearly. That sounds like a basic human need, not a spiritual obstacle. But here's the distinction Jung was drawing, and it is a razor-thin one that makes all the difference. There is a profound difference between desiring genuine connection, which includes being known and seen by people who are capable of knowing and seeing you, and needing others to understand you in order to feel valid in your own experience. The first is healthy. The second is a form of outsourcing your reality to other people's comprehension of it. And that outsourcing, however understandable its origins, keeps you permanently tethered to a frequency determined by whether or not someone else can follow you there. Think about what actually happens in those long explanatory conversations. You are not just sharing your perspective. You are seeking a verdict. You want the other person to hear you out and conclude, yes, you were right to feel that. Yes, that makes sense. Yes, I understand why you did what you did. And until you get that verdict, some part of you remains in a kind of suspended distress, unable to fully settle into your own knowing, because you have not yet received external confirmation that your knowing is legitimate. What Jung found in the people who genuinely elevated their consciousness was that they had developed something he considered essential to individuation. He called it internal authority, a relationship with your own truth so solid, so grounded, so thoroughly yours, that it does not require anyone else's comprehension to remain intact. They knew what they knew. They felt what they felt. And whether the person across from them could track that or not did not change the reality of their experience one degree. This is genuinely radical in a world that teaches us from our earliest years that our perceptions need to be validated by the people around us to count as real. Children who are told you are too sensitive, that did not happen, you are overreacting, learn that their inner experience cannot be trusted without external confirmation. And so they spend the rest of their lives seeking that confirmation, constructing elaborate explanations, finding just the right language, doing the emotional labor of translating their interior world into something palatable enough for others to accept. It is exhausting work, and it never fully succeeds, because the problem was never your inability to explain yourself clearly enough. The problem is that some people are not capable of understanding you, and no amount of better wording will change that. Here is something worth sitting with. The people who most consistently fail to understand you are often not failing because of a lack of information. They are failing because understanding you would require them to see things in a way that disrupts their own story. Your clarity is sometimes inconvenient to people who have a vested interest in their version of events. Your emotional reality is sometimes threatening to people who have built their identity around not feeling theirs, and so they will not understand you, not because you explained it badly, but because understanding you costs them something they are not yet ready to pay. More explanation will not solve that. Only distance or acceptance will. Releasing the need to be understood does not mean closing yourself off. It does not mean you stop sharing, stop being vulnerable, stop seeking genuine connection. It means you become discerning about where you invest the energy of explanation. You share yourself with people who have demonstrated the capacity to receive you. And with everyone else, you practice something far more powerful than explanation. You practice simply knowing your own truth without needing to perform it for an audience. Jung warned that this release comes with a specific kind of loneliness at first. Because when you stop over-explaining yourself, when you stop chasing understanding from people who are not equipped to offer it, some relationships will thin out. There will be a period where you feel less connected, less seen, more solitary than before. And that feeling is real and it deserves to be honored. But what Jung also observed is that on the other side of that loneliness is a quality of connection that the over-explainers never find, because they are always too busy managing other people's perceptions to actually be present with them. When you are no longer performing your inner world for external approval, you become available for something rarer and more nourishing. You become available for the kind of conversation where you do not have to explain yourself at all, because the other person already speaks something close to your language. You will know you are releasing this when someone misunderstands you and you feel the pull to correct them, and then you let it go. When you can walk away from a conversation where you were completely unseen and feel intact rather than frantic. When your sense of your own reality no longer waits at the door for someone else to let it in. That is internal authority. That is a high frequency place to live from. And it becomes available the moment you stop handing the keys to your inner world to people who were never going to know what to do with them anyway. The fourth thing you must give up is the fantasy of who people could become. I want you to think about someone in your life right now, someone you love or have loved or are still trying to love, despite the growing weight of evidence that loving them costs you more than it returns. Maybe it is a parent who has never quite been able to see you, Ma. Maybe it is a partner who keeps showing you, in small and large ways, who they actually are, while you keep responding to who you believe they could be if they just did the work, healed the wound, made the choice, had the breakthrough. Maybe it is a friend who has let you down so many times that you have lost count, but who you keep returning to because you can see so clearly the person buried underneath the behavior. The person they would be, if only. That if only is the thing Jung wanted you to examine, because it is not as innocent as it feels. Jung called this mechanism projection. And in the context of relationships, projection is the psychological process by which we take something that lives inside us, a need, a fear, a longing, an unresolved hope, and we place it onto another person, experiencing it as though it belongs to them rather than to us. When we look at someone and see their potential, when we relate to the person they could become rather than the person they are right now, we are not actually seeing them at all. We are seeing a screen onto which we have projected our own interior world. And we are staying in relationship with that screen, not with the human being standing in front of us. This is not a character flaw. It is a deeply human response to pain. Because seeing people clearly, exactly as they are, requires us to make decisions based on that clarity. And sometimes those decisions are devastating. It is far less painful in the short term to believe that the person who keeps hurting you is simply one good conversation away from transformation, one moment of genuine insight away from becoming who you need them to be. The fantasy keeps you from having to grieve the reality. And grief, as anyone who has done it honestly knows, is one of the most demanding things a human being can move through. But here's what Jung observed about the long-term costs of living inside that fantasy. When you relate to someone's potential rather than their reality, you are not only failing to see them clearly, you are failing to see yourself clearly too. Because every unit of energy you invest in the person they could become is energy you are not investing in your own life, your own becoming, your own transformation. The fantasy is not just a story about them, it is a way of putting your own growth on hold, suspended in a waiting room where you will finally be able to move forward once they change. And they are not going to change. Not because people cannot change. People absolutely can and do. But because change of the kind you are hoping for requires a level of willingness that either exists in a person or it does not. And your believing in their potential more than they currently believe in it themselves has never once been the thing that tipped the scale. Jung was also clear about something that most people find deeply uncomfortable to hear. The intensity with which you see someone's potential is often directly proportional to the depth of your own unmet need. If you are desperately convinced that your emotionally unavailable parent is capable of finally seeing you, that conviction is less about them and more about the part of you that still needs to be seen by them in order to feel whole. If you cannot stop believing that your partner will eventually become the person you know they could be, That belief is less about their hidden capacity and more about what you have not yet found inside yourself. The projection tells you more about your wound than it tells you about their potential. This does not make you naive. It makes you human. But Jung would insist, with great compassion and zero apology, that healing requires you to take the projection back, to look at what you have been placing onto other people, and ask yourself, what I? He is telling you about what you still need to find within yourself. Because the moment you do that, two things happen simultaneously. You begin to see the actual people in your life with a clarity that is both painful and profoundly freeing. And you begin to redirect your energy toward your own interior, which is where the real work has been waiting all along. Releasing this fantasy requires grief. Jung was adamant about that, and I will not soften it for you. You have to mourn the parent who may never see you. You have to mourn the partner who showed you again and again exactly who they were while you kept looking past the evidence. You have to mourn the friendship that was built on who you hoped they would become rather than who they actually are. That grief is not a sign that you loved wrongly. It is the necessary passage through which you move from fantasy into reality. And reality, as brutal as it can feel in the first moments of clear seeing, is the only ground solid enough to build anything real on. You will know you are releasing this when someone shows you a pattern you have seen from them before, and instead of thinking about how that pattern could change, you simply believe them. When you can look at the people you love and make decisions based on who they are today, not who they might be tomorrow. When your hope for someone's growth no longer requires you to stay in a situation that is diminishing you. That is not pessimism. That is not hardness. That is the particular kind of love that Jung considered the most mature form available to us. The love that sees clearly, chooses consciously, and refuses to insult another person by relating to a version of them that does not yet exist. See people as they are, love them as they are, and then decide with full information whether who they are is someone you want to walk beside. That decision, made from clarity rather than fantasy, is one of the highest frequency choices a human being can make. Most people get this completely backwards. When they picture the empath in a relationship with a narcissist, they picture someone fragile, someone who cried too easily, loved too deeply, stayed too long, someone who in the end had to be rescued from their own softness. And when that empath finally walks away, people assume it was the hardest thing they ever did, that they barely made it out, that they left broken, barely holding themselves together, while the narcissist moved on without a second thought, composed, unbothered, already hunting for the next person to fill the vacancy. That story is not just incomplete. It is the opposite of what actually happens, because here is what nobody tells you. The moment an empath walks away, truly walks away, not the threat, not the pause, not the quiet withdrawal that still leaves a door cracked open, something begins to collapse on the other side. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in a way the narcissist will ever admit to, but structurally, psychologically, at a level so deep it touches the foundation of who they believe themselves to be. And understanding why that happens, understanding the precise mechanism behind it, will change the way you see everything that came before it. Let's start with what most people miss about the empath's role in the relationship. Not the role everyone talks about, the listener, the healer, the one who always apologized first. That much people understand. What they miss is the invisible role, the one operating beneath every conversation, beneath every conflict, beneath every moment of tension that somehow got resolved without anyone quite knowing how. The empath was the emotional infrastructure of the relationship. Think about what that actually means. Every time the narcissist became volatile, someone absorbed it. Every time their insecurity spiked and sent them into a spiral of rage or cold silence, someone worked to stabilize the atmosphere. Every time reality threatened to expose the gap between who the narcissists performed themselves to be and who they actually were underneath, someone quietly, consistently, often without even realizing it, smoothed that gap over, not with confrontation, not with ultimatums, but with presence, with attunement, with a nervous system so finely tuned to the emotional temperature of the room that it could de-escalate a crisis before the narcissist even consciously registered there was one. That is not weakness. That is a level of emotional sophistication most people will never develop. It just happened to be pointed in entirely the wrong direction. Now, here is where it gets critical, because this is the piece that unlocks everything else. The narcissist did not simply benefit from this dynamic. They became dependent on it, and there is a profound difference between those two things. A person who benefits from something can function without it. A person who is dependent on it cannot, not in the same way, not at the same level, not without significant deterioration. The narcissist's psychological stability, their ability to feel calm, to feel confident, to feel like a coherent self with a coherent identity, was not something they generated from within. It was not something they borrowed continuously from the empath standing right beside them. Every time the empath soothed, the narcissist regulated. Every time the empath absorbed the tension, the narcissist exhaled. Every time the empath reflected something warm and attentive back at them, the narcissist's sense of self temporarily solidified. This is what psychologists call narcissistic supply, but that term flattens it. It makes it sound transactional, like filling a tank with fuel. What was actually happening was more intimate and more disturbing than that. The empath was functioning as an external nervous system for someone who had never learned to regulate their own, not because they lacked the capacity in some fixed biological sense, but because somewhere much early in their life, that capacity was never built. They learned instead to outsource it, to control their environment, to control the people in it, and above all, to secure a steady source of emotional regulation from whoever they were closest to. And the empath, with all the depth and attunement and quiet patience, was the most effective source of that regulation they had ever found. So it looks from the outside like a powerful person and a submissive partner. Is underneath the surface something far stranger. It is a person performing strength while being secretly sustained by someone they claim to not need. A structure that looks solid from every angle but is, at its core, hollow, held up entirely by a foundation it refuses to acknowledge. And here is the moment everything changes. The empath reaches a point, not a dramatic point, not usually, not a screaming match that finally crosses a line, not a single unforgivable moment. It is something quieter and more final than that. It is the moment they realize that every attempt to repair, to communicate, to reach something real in this person has returned empty, that the relationship has not been difficult. Difficult things can be worked through. It has been consuming. It has been taking and returning almost nothing that actually sustains a human being. And at some level, beneath thought, beneath strategy, something in them simply stops, not with anger, not with a prepared speech, with a stillness, and they walk away. Now pay close attention to what happens next, because this is not a story about the empath finally escaping. It is only half the story, and it is the less interesting half. The more important story, the one that explains so much of what you have probably already witnessed or lived through, is what begins to happen inside the narcissist the moment that stabilizing force is removed. Not eventually, not after weeks of reflection, immediately, because the system that was keeping them regulated just went offline. And unlike every other time the empath threatened to leave, pulled back, or went quiet, this time they are not coming back to smooth things over. This time the absence is real, and the narcissist psyche, which has never once learned to sit with itself, is now sitting alone, with no buffer, no mirror, no one to outsource the unbearable work of being human to. And that is where the psychological hell begins. Not with grief, not with longing, with something far more destabilizing than either, with silence. Silence is not nothing. That is the first thing you need to understand about what the narcissist faces the moment the empath is truly gone. Most people think of silence as an absence, the absence of noise, the absence of company, the absence of distraction. And on the surface, that is exactly what it looks like. An empty apartment, a phone that is not lighting up with the particular name it used to, a space where someone's presence used to live, that is now just space. But for the narcissist, this silence is not an absence, it is an exposure. Let me explain exactly what that means, because the distinction matters more than almost anything else in understanding this dynamic. When the empath was present, when they were there to absorb, to soothe, to reflect, to engage, the narcissist's internal world had somewhere to go. Their anxiety could be discharged through control. Their insecurity could be dissolved through validation. Their fear of being truly seen, truly K, now truly found inadequate at the core, that fear could be endlessly deferred, projected outward, or buried beneath the performance of dominance. The empath's presence, ironically, made all of that avoidance possible. Not intentionally, but functionally, that is precisely what was happening. Now that presence is gone, and what remains is a psychological interior that has never been examined, never been processed, never been forced to sit with itself without the immediate relief of external input. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Most people, when they are alone with themselves, experience something. Memories surface, emotions arise, a sense of their own inner life, with all its texture and complexity, makes itself known. For most people, this is not always comfortable, but it is familiar. It is the baseline experience of being a conscious human being who has spent some time actually inhabiting their own inner world. The narcissist has spent a lifetime avoiding exactly that, not through laziness, not through simple selfishness, though. That is the easy explanation people reach for. But through a survival mechanism so deeply embedded it no longer feels like a choice. Somewhere early in childhood, in formative relationships, in experiences that shape the template for how emotional reality gets processed. This person learned that the inner world was not safe, that feelings, when felt fully, led somewhere intolerable. That vulnerability was not a doorway to connection, but a vector for pain. And so they built something over it, a structure of performance, of control, a perpetual outward focus that kept them from ever having to go inward for too long. That structure held as long as they had the right external conditions to maintain it. The empath was the most important of those conditions. So when the empath leaves, the silence that descends is not peaceful. It is not the silence of rest or resolution. It is the silence of a dam holding back something that has been accumulating for years, decades, sometimes an entire lifetime, and the dam just lost its primary support. Nothing breaks immediately. The structure is still standing technically, but something has shifted at the foundation, and the narcissist can feel it, even if they cannot name it, even if every instinct they have is screaming at them to not name it, to not look at it, to find something, anything to fill the space before it gets any louder. This is why what happens next is so predictable once you understand the mechanism behind it. The narcissist does not sit with the silence. They cannot. The psychological architecture that was built precisely to avoid that kind of stillness immediately kicks into gear, scanning the environment for a replacement input, something to re-regulate, someone to fill the mirror, a new source of the validation and emotional stability that just walked out the door. And they move fast, faster than the people watching from the outside usually expect, fast enough that it can look from the outside like the empath meant nothing, like the relationship was disposable, like they have already moved on, already replaced what was lost, already returned to that composure that made them seem so untouchable throughout the entire relationship. Do not be fooled by the speed. The speed is not evidence of indifference. The speed is evidence of desperation, because a person who is genuinely regulated, genuinely at peace with themselves, genuinely capable of sitting with loss and processing it, that person does not need to move fast. They can afford to feel it. They can afford to be still. The person who needs to move fast is the person for whom stillness is genuinely intolerable, for whom the absence of external input creates something. Being so destabilizing that speed becomes the only available defense against it. Watch what they reach for. It is almost always something loud, something stimulating. A new person pursued with an intensity that seems disproportionate. A sudden investment in social visibility, being seen, being admired, being publicly fine. Sometimes the opposite, a retreat into victimhood, a campaign to reframe the story so that the empath becomes the villain and the narcissist becomes the one who was wronged, the one who deserves sympathy, the one whose suffering should be recognized and tended to by anyone still in the orbit. All of it is the same thing, wearing different clothes. All of it is an attempt to silence the silence. But here is what the narcissist is discovering beneath all the motion and noise and frantic reaching, and this is the part that truly begins the psychological hell. The replacements do not work the same way, not even close. The new person, whoever they are, provides attention, provides validation, provides the initial hit of something that feels like what was lost, but it does not regulate in the same way. It does not go as deep. It does not settle the internal turbulence with the same quiet efficiency that the empath's presence once did, and the narcissist cannot understand why. They do not have the vocabulary for what they are missing. They do not have the self-awareness to identify it precisely. But they can feel the contrast, a vague, persistent, deeply uncomfortable sense that something the new situation is providing is thinner somehow, more surface, less stabilizing, like a meal that fills the stomach but does not satisfy the hunger underneath it. That contrast does not go away. It lingers. It agitates. It quietly confirms what the silence was already trying to tell them, that what they lost was not simply a person. It was a function, a rare, deeply developed, irreplaceable function that took years to cultivate and that cannot be replicated simply by finding someone new and applying the same pressure to them. The empath was not replaceable, and somewhere beneath all the noise, the narcissist is beginning to feel exactly that. There is a moment that comes for the narcissist, not immediately, not cleanly, and not in a way they will ever describe out loud, where the usual strategies stop working well enough to keep the internal noise quiet. The new person is there, but does not quite fit. The social performance is running, but feels hollow underneath. The story they have been telling about what happened, about who is at fault, about how they are better off, about how the empath was too sensitive or too demanding or simply not right for them. That story has been rehearsed enough times that it should feel solid by now. It should feel true. But there are moments, usually quiet ones, usually at night, or in the strange stillness between one distraction and the next, where it does not quite hold together, where something underneath it shifts slightly, and a different version of events flickers at the edge of awareness before being immediately, forcefully pushed back down. That flicker is the beginning of something they are entirely unprepared for. Understand what projection actually does for the narcissist, because this is the mechanism that everything else depends on. Projection is not simply blaming other people, though it includes that. It is the psychological process of taking everything that feels intolerable about the self, the inadequacy, the fear, the neediness, the anger that has no clean origin, the shame that sits at the bottom of everything, and relocating it, placing it outside the self, attaching it to someone else so that it can be observed, managed, criticized, and ultimately controlled at a safe distance, rather than felt from the inside. The empath, over the course of the relationship, became the primary container for all of that projected material. Every flaw the narcissist could not acknowledge in themselves found a home in the empath. Too emotional, too needy, too much, not enough. Impossible to satisfy. Always making things harder than they needed to be. The empath, with their deep capacity for self-reflection and their unfortunate tendency to absorb criticism as though it were feedback worth considering, accepted much of this projection without fully recognizing it for what it was. They internalized it. They worked on themselves in response to it. They wondered, often in the darkest hours of the relationship, whether the narcissist was right, whether they really were the problem, whether their sensitivity was a flaw, whether their need for genuine emotional connection was somehow unreasonable. That is what projection does when it lands on someone who is willing to receive it. It does not just redirect the narcissist's discomfort, it actively reshapes the empath's perception of themselves. It is one of the quieter cruelties of the dynamic and one of the most lasting. But now the empath is gone, and with them goes the container. So what happens to all that projected material? Where does it go when there is no longer a willing surface for it to land on? This is the part that the narcissist is wholly unprepared for. Because projection as a psychological defense requires an external target, it requires someone to carry the weight of what the narcissist cannot bear to feel as their own. Without that target, the projection has nowhere to travel. And what was being projected does not simply dissolve because the container has left the room. It returns, not all at once, not in a clear, recognizable way that the narcissist could name and address, but in fragments, in a vague, creeping discomfort that has no obvious source, in irritability that flares without clear cause, in a restlessness that does not respond to the usual remedies, in moments where the internal narrative, the one that has always maintained that they are fine, that they are strong, that everyone else is the problem, develops small, almost imperceptible cracks. And those cracks are terrifying, not because of what they reveal, but because of what revealing them would mean. Because here is the deeper truth, that the narcissistic structure was built specifically to avoid, beneath the control, beneath the performance, beneath the carefully maintained image of someone who needs nothing and is affected by nothing. There is a person who is profoundly afraid, not of the empath specifically, not of any one relationship or any one loss, but of themselves, of their own interior, of the possibility that if they were to actually stop, actually be still, actually turn inward without the buffer of distraction or the relief of external validation, what they would find there would confirm the very thing the entire structure was built to deny, that they are not who they perform themselves to be, that behind the dominance is anxiety, behind the confidence is a need for approval, so raw and so unrelenting it would be humiliating to acknowledge. Behind the coldness is a grief so old and so unprocessed that they would not even know where to begin with it. Behind the certainty that everyone else is the problem is a quiet, insistent, devastating awareness that they have played a role in every relationship that has ever failed them, and that the pattern is not accidental. That awareness does not arrive as insight. Insight would require a willingness to look. What arrives instead is disturbance, a psychological turbulence that has no clean label, no obvious cause, no external target to attach it to, just a feeling, persistent, shapeless, deeply uncomfortable, that something is wrong in a way that cannot be fixed by finding someone new or telling the story differently or staying busy enough. And this is where the hell becomes specific, because the narcissist now faces a problem they have no tools to solve. Every coping mechanism they have ever developed was designed for external management, control the environment, control the narrative, control other people's perceptions, secure the supply, redirect the discomfort outward. None of those tools work on an internal experience that has no external surface to grip. You cannot control your way out of your own unprocessed shame. You cannot manipulate your way past the grief you have been outrunning for decades. You cannot secure enough validation from enough new sources to permanently silence the part of you that knows, at some level that precedes language, that you have been living at a distance from yourself for as long as you can remember. The empath, without ever intending to and without ever knowing it was happening, made that distance sustainable. Their presence was the mechanism that kept the narcissist just far enough from their own interior that the confrontation never had to happen. Their attunement softened every edge. Their patience absorbed every spike of internal chaos before it could build into something that demanded genuine self-examination. Their love, real, deep, costly love, functioned in the architecture of the relationship as the narcissist's most effective escape route from themselves. Now that route is closed, and the narcissist is standing at the entrance to a place they have spent their entire adult life, making sure they never had to enter. Not a place of punishment, not a consequence delivered from the outside, but the simple, unavoidable, profoundly human experience of having to sit with themselves, with their actual feelings, with their actual history, with the actual gap between the person they have performed and the person they actually are underneath all of it. Some will run harder. Some will fill the space with more noise, more people, more motion, more distraction. Some will double down on the narrative, harden the story, make the empath more of a villain with every retelling until the fiction is airtight enough to live in comfortably again. But even those who run the hardest carry something with them now that they did not carry before. A knowledge that cannot be fully unknowed, a crack in the structure that does not fully seal, a silence that follows them even into the noise, persistent and patient, waiting for the moment the distractions finally thin out enough to be heard. Because the empath walked away, and in walking away, they did not just leave a gap in the narcissist's life. They removed the one thing that was standing between the narcissist and the truth about themselves. And that truth, once it starts pressing upward, does not stop simply because someone is not ready to face it. So we arrive at the part nobody talks about. Not the rage, not the replacement, not the smear campaign, or the sudden reappearance with a perfectly rehearsed apology. Those are the parts that get discussed. The visible, dramatic, external behaviors that are easy to point at and analyze. But beneath all of that performance, beneath every strategy the narcissist deploys in the aftermath of the empath's departure, something else is unfolding. Something slower, something that does not announce itself, something that operates at a level far beneath behavior, in the place where identity lives and where, for the narcissist, the most fundamental, most frightening questions are beginning to surface, whether they are ready for them or not. The question not whether the empath will come back. They have already moved past that, even if they will not admit it. The question that is now pressing itself upward, quietly, insistently, in the spaces between every distraction they throw at it, is something far more destabilizing. Who am I without someone to reflect me back to myself? That question sounds simple. For most people, it would not even register as threatening. Most people have a stable enough inner relationship with themselves that the answer, while perhaps complex and layered, is ultimately accessible. They know what they value. They know what they feel. They know what they want. That is not contingent on someone else's reaction to them. Their identity does not require an audience to exist. The narcissist does not have that. And this is not an insult. It is a diagnosis of a specific developmental wound. At some point, for reasons that are almost always rooted in early experiences of conditional love, inconsistent attachment, or environments where performing was the only reliable way to secure safety, this person never built a stable, autonomous relationship with their own interior. They built instead an identity that lives on the outside, in the reactions of others, in the image they project, in the role they play within whatever relational system they currently occupy. Remove the system and the role disappears with it. Remove the audience and the performance has nowhere to land. Remove the empath and the most sophisticated, most responsive, most deeply attuned mirror they ever had access to goes dark. And what they are left with is something that feels from the inside like nothing, not peace, not solitude, not even grief, which would at least be something real to hold on to. Just a flatness, a kind of psychological static where a coherent sense of self used to be. An interior that was never furnished because were always too busy managing the exterior to ever spend any real time in there. This is the hell that does not look like hell from the outside. From the outside, the narcissist may appear to be doing remarkably well. They may be more socially active than ever, surrounding themselves with new people, new validation, new mirrors. They may have already begun a new relationship, moving through the early stages with an intensity that looks, to anyone watching, like passion. They may be performing the narrative of someone who has moved on cleanly, someone who is thriving, someone who was, in the end, the one who was wronged and has now risen above it. The performance may be genuinely convincing. They have spent a lifetime perfecting exactly this kind of performance, and they are good at it. But performance is not the same as experience. And the experience on the inside tells a completely different story, because every new mirror shows them something slightly off. Every new relationship provides validation, but not regulation. Every new person who reflects admiration back at them fills the space temporarily, but does not touch the specific ache that the empath's absence created. And that ache is not about love, not exactly, though it may feel like love to the narcissist, because they have never clearly distinguished between love and supply, between connection and regulation, between wanting someone and needing them as a psychological function. The ache is about stability, about the specific, rare, deeply personal kind of stability that came from being known, not fully, not honestly, not in the way that genuine intimacy requires, but known in the sense that someone understood how to be around them, how to absorb them, how to keep the internal chaos at a manageable distance. That is gone now, and nothing that has arrived to replace it quite fits. Here is what this does over time, because the narcissist does not process this the way a healthier person processes loss, through grief, through reflection, through a gradual integration of the experience into a more complex and honest self-understanding. The unresolved material does not diminish. It accumulates. Every replacement that fails to fully regulate adds another layer to the underlying dissatisfaction. Every moment of internal static that cannot be silenced through external input deepens the structural problem that the empath's departure exposed. Every night that ends without the specific quality of presence that once made the internal world bearable makes the internal world slightly less bearable than it was before. And the narcissist, who has no framework for understanding what is happening to them, no language for the specific nature of what they lost, no capacity to turn inward and examine the wound directly, begins to feel something that their entire psychological architecture was built to prevent them from ever feeling: hollow, not sad, not lonely, not guilty, though fragments of something adjacent to guilt may surface briefly before being rapidly buried, but hollow in a way that is structural rather than emotional. Empty at the center in a way that external filling cannot address, because the emptiness is not about what is missing from the outside. It is about what was never built on the inside. And the empath's presence for all those months or years was the thing that papered over that hollow center so effectively that the narcissist never had to feel it directly. Now they feel it in doses, in flashes, in the quiet moments that their strategies cannot fully eliminate. And each time it surfaces, the instinct is to immediately suppress it. More noise, more stimulation, more validation, more motion. But suppression is not resolution. And the hollow does not simply be, because something has been placed on top of it This is the psychological reality that the empath needs to understand as they build their life on the other side of that relationship. Not because the narcissist's suffering is their responsibility. It is not, and it never was. But because understanding it dismantles one of the most persistent and damaging stories the empath has been carrying since they left. The story that says the narcissist was fine without them. That says they were easily replaced. That says the relationship meant nothing, that their depth meant nothing, that the years of presence and attunement and quiet, costly love left no mark on the person who received it. That story is not true. The mark is there. It is just located somewhere the narcissist will never publicly acknowledge and may never consciously examine. It lives in the specific quality of what every subsequent relationship lacks. It lives in the dissatisfaction that surfaces between distractions. It lives in the hollow center that the empath's absence finally made impossible to completely ignore. And for the empath, understanding this is not about vindication. It is not about satisfaction at another person's suffering. It is about something far more important than that. It is about finally fully releasing the distorted self-image the relationship created. The one that said they were too much or not enough. The one that said their sensitivity was a flaw and their depth was a burden. The one that said they were the difficult one, the unstable one, the one whose emotional needs were unreasonable and whose love was somehow insufficient despite the extraordinary cost of giving it. None of that was true. It was projection finding a surface to land on. It was a hollow structure outsourcing its own emptiness to the most capable person in the room. The empath was not the problem. The empath was the solution, the one the narcissist was never willing to deserve. And walking away was not a failure. It was not an admission of defeat or an act of giving up on someone who needed them. It was the moment the empath finally stopped funding a structure that was consuming everything they had while offering nothing real in return. It was the moment they reclaimed the energy, the depth, the extraordinary capacity for presence and attunement that had been quietly redirected for so long, and turned it back toward the only person it was always supposed to primarily serve, themselves. So if you are on the other side of this, if you are the one who walked away or who is thinking about it or who left long ago and is still carrying the weight of a story that was never really yours, hear this clearly. Your presence had weight. Your love had value. Your depth was real and it was rare. And it mattered more than the person who needed it most was ever capable of telling you. And the fact that they could not recognize it while they had it does not diminish it. It simply confirms what you perhaps always suspected, but were too generous to fully believe, that what they lost when you walked away was not replaceable. Not then, not now. Not with anyone new or any strategy or any amount of noise placed carefully over the silence you left behind. The silence is still there. It will always be there. And somewhere in it, if they are ever still enough to listen, is the only truth that ever had the power to actually help them, the one they spent a lifetime running from, the one that begins with sitting down, going quiet, and finally, after everything, facing themselves.